Say what you want about the quality of newer releases, a lot of us will always look at older titles as classics. And while some games will come along and eventually become modern classics, to many, nothing will quite beat these original masterpieces. However, a big negative with these older titles is that it's certainly harder for newer individuals to experience these games, as if you wanted to play them legally, you'd have to most likely buy a console you didn't own from an older generation, find the game itself that is probably way overpriced, and have to deal with all sorts of different headaches just to get into a game that you may find hasn't really aged the best. So what is a company to do with a very popular game that's hard for people to find and play legally? And of course, to them, the bigger problem of not making money from it anymore, well, that's where remakes come in. They've been happening for a while now, and it doesn't seem like they have any sign of stopping. Now, there's a whole conversation about remakes and their purpose, when a remake is needed or when it's not needed, and in all honesty, it's a topic for a whole other video that will probably happen down the line. But for the sake of the topic today, that being, if you read the title, Silent Hill 2, I'm going to be going into this specific topic with a very specific mindset. No matter what one's stance is on remakes, I'm going into this video with the mindset of how does this game compare to the first time experience, compared to the original first time experience. I'm not going to be looking at accessibility, I'm just going to compare it as if you owned the original, haven't played it yet, have all the things to play it, and you have the option of playing this new one, if that makes sense. Also, I'll be doing some comparison to the original game and other game remakes, but I'll be trying to limit that as much as I can, and one of those methods is going to be limiting my pool that I'll look at. The two major I'm going to be looking at is going to be the Dead Space remake and the much more recent Until Dawn remake, as both of those are horror games, and I think that they both have interesting points to bring up when talking about such a big topic like this one. Lastly, of course, are going to be a spoiler warning. They're going to be kept to a minimum for the most part. I'll give you the opening moments of the story so you have some context, but outside of that, I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as I can. Or possibly can, anyway. As if you have any interest in playing Silent Hill, especially Silent Hill 2, and you've been somehow lucky enough to not have been spoiled on its story, I so very highly recommend going into it blind, as it is a great gaming experience through and through. With that being said, grab your crippling mental state as we return to the sleepy little town of Silent Hill. The game's opening follows the original pretty closely, with our main character, James Sunderland, as he has an internal monologue where we are given the foundation of the story. James Sunderland has recently received a letter from his wife saying,
"In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now. In our special place, waiting for you."
This alone doesn't seem too weird, until we come to find out that his wife, Mary, has in fact been deceased for 3 years now, after succumbing to some unnamed disease.
Mary died of that damn disease 3 years ago. So then why am I looking for her?
And that's all your foundation. You have a grieving husband who, still clearly by his body language, hasn't gotten over his wife's passing. And the fact that most normal people would probably brush off getting this letter from somebody who's deceased as someone being really mean. As simple as it seems, it immediately gives you motivation that almost anyone can understand. Unfortunately, grief and loss is something we all have to deal with, and having to lose someone you love as much as a partner is obviously devastating. Even if normally, almost anyone, myself included, would say, of course we wouldn't go to this random town after getting a letter from someone who has been deceased for multiple years. We all can also fully understand why someone who has gone through something so devastating would want to hold out hope, and would be willing to follow along with this admittedly almost delusional thought. Now, of course, I'm going to bring up what I think was the biggest talking point when it came to speculation and critical conversations that surrounded the remake, from the trailers itself anyway. That being the drastic change and how we would look at this world that we'd be playing through in Silent Hill 2. And no, I'm not talking about the graphics, I'm actually talking about the camera angle. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, back when Silent Hill 2 was first released, the horror genre was definitely getting more popular. Of course, we can think of Silent Hill, but there were also titles like Resident Evil, over a bunch of other ones, of course. Now, many of the ones we'll see nowadays with modern horror games, a lot of the nuances and game mechanics, of course, weren't established yet. The genre was still simply too new, and one that was growing. And you'll see from almost all the old school horror games, one of the similarities is that of the camera angle. Generally, you're watching the character from and seeing the world unfold. It's typically fixated to certain locations depending on where you enter a certain area. Now, this technique was done for multiple reasons. One is that it can be quite simple, in comparison, to simply put your camera at a specific fixed location where they can clearly see the entire room, rather than having to design and program a whole camera system that will follow the player, especially back when 3D games were still in their infancy. A lot of these cameras are notoriously terrible, but Silent Hill 2 actually added to the overall experience as it helped set the atmosphere, especially during tense segments, so the camera change was a big point of contention with the remake. Other games remakes for horror games have been doing this, like Resident Evil 2's, and while it definitely changes the atmosphere, the camera itself works fine. There was only one or two moments where it felt as though it had some problems, and mostly, if I'm being honest, it was if I tried stuffing James into some corner he probably didn't belong in the first place. But in general, it was rare that this camera had any problems. I'm certain the main complaint that people would probably have with it is that it changes the feel of the game. But to be fair, I think when you're remaking any game, no matter how little or big the changes are, it's going to feel like and be a different experience. And that's fine. Well, yes, this is a remake and it should be faithful to what it's remaking. One of the reasons to remake something is the desire to modernize it, or change things that weren't that great about the original. Anyway, I digress. Really quickly, I'll just say this about the story. As I said, I am not going to spoil the rest of it or anything like that. What I will say is for those who are concerned about them changing the story up, and were concerned since a lot of Silent Hill 2's story is tied around heavy symbolism and a detailed world building, and while some story beats have changed in the order they go, and the path to get there has changed slightly, for the most part the story beats are the same. Sure, some of the dialogue may have shifted around a little bit, but again, I'd wager that the story being told is still pretty much one-to-one with the original. Another big point of contention with the remake was the voice cast. And no, it wasn't anything against these new individuals we brought into the project, but from what I could tell, it seemed like a lot of people were concerned as, well, it's kind of hard to explain. You see, the original Silent Hill 2 had a lot of things that felt professionally done. The music, for example, which still stands out and is still great in the remake, by the way. The use of things like fog, the enemies and character designs were all great, and the story was top tier. So, storytelling, character design, and music was great, but there was one thing that kinda stands out, if you were to go back to the original. Here, let's just compare this cutscene from the opening of the game with the original.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry. I was just...
Hey, it's okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
Yeah, I'm looking for Silent Hill. Is this the right way?
Yeah. It's hard to see with this fog, but there's only the one road. You can't miss it.
Thanks.
Excuse me,
I'm sorry. I
No,
was
it's
just...
okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
Yeah. I'm looking for Silent Hill. Is this the right way?
Yeah. It's hard to see with this fog, but there's only the one road.
The voice acting isn't bad in the old games, though. I'm sure an argument could be made that that is the reason it sounds the way it does. But part of the odd voice acting is to help fit into the narrative. The uncanny voice acting and almost lack of emotion at certain segments that feel like they really should have them helped play into the unease of everything around you. It's, again, kind of hard to explain, but essentially you could write it off as people who grew up with the game or played the original were scared to see how they would approach this. As, just for some context, Silent Hill 2 would get a port later on that would, in many fans' eyes, be a disappointment, such as ruining quote-unquote the fog and changing the voice acting so that it sounded, I guess, more professional, and people didn't like it. So with a new voice cast and more realistic facial reactions thanks to modern technology, people were concerned that this uncanny feeling would be lost. And for me personally at least, I think that all of the actors involved did a phenomenal job. When it comes to thinking about Silent Hill 2 as a modern experience, I think that this fits perfectly. It doesn't ride the border of almost feeling like poor voice acting that the original had, but it doesn't feel like over the top to the point of it clearly being overplayed theater kids. Not that there's anything wrong with theater kids, by the way. But every single voice actor involved in general, I think did a really fantastic job. I'm quite certain some people are still not going to be super thrilled by it all, but I think if you're approaching this game with the mindset of it not being a replacement for the original, but rather a way for people to have a modern perspective and experience with it, I think that you'll find it pretty decent. Again, I thought all the actors did a good job, and I'll be honest, I definitely don't envy any of these actors, or heck even Team Bloober, for having to play a character and remake something as tremendous and big and, well, I guess just celebrated as Silent Hill, especially considering how much this franchise and the characters mean so much to people. So, I've talked slightly about the story, I've talked about the character cast, and I've touched very lightly on music just because Konami has some problems with people talking about their music, but it's good. So I guess really fast I'll talk about the art direction. I personally think that the upgrade looks really good and plays into the environment in an amazing new way. There were actually multiple times throughout my playthrough where I'd be out walking around Silent Hill and I would end up spending time just standing staring at certain set pieces just because of how well they atmospherically would actually play in. And for me, it really goes to show just how much can be done with an atmosphere in a world like Silent Hill with modern gaming hardware to back it up. So, now that I've touched on all that stuff, I feel like all that remains is to talk about one of the most baseline things of any game. What is the gameplay? Well, for the most part, it's a lot of puzzle solving and some clunky combat. Silent Hill is pretty notorious for having some obscure puzzles that can be genuinely really challenging to figure out, and having combat that is really clunky, purposefully, so that way you'll try to avoid combat as many times as you can. Though, thankfully, both of these mechanics actually have difficulty settings, which is really cool. A feature that I think more games should implement. Not just difficulty sliders for combat segments, but also for people who maybe aren't in it for the puzzles as much, or still want puzzles, but maybe isn't down for puzzles that could take up to 3 hours to solve, then being able to change the difficulty is really cool. For the most part, the puzzles are still really good. Some of them are pretty similar, not the exact same to the original, and some I've shifted slightly, which I think is a good combination. Just for context, I had my first playthrough on the hardest difficulty for puzzles, and the normal difficulty for combat. And I'm really glad I chose to do so, because now we get to talk about the other part, which will be the last touching point for this video. The combat. Now, as I had stated multiple times in this video already, alone, Silent Hill, and honestly a lot of older horror games, are notorious for clunky and sometimes, lack of a better word, pretty not fun combat mechanics. Whether it be too weird and wacky animations, it being slow and really not interesting, or just controlling really poorly. Controlling these games were notoriously bad, and for some of them it was a genuine problem. There were games like the original Resident Evil that thrust you into combat every 5 seconds or so, and having to do that with these tanky controls is really annoying. But then there are some like the original Silent Hill that is done so on purpose, so that way you'll try to avoid combat when you can, and for the most part you're usually given ample opportunities to do so. It was pretty safe to say, in the original game you weren't going to learn the combat, you were more so learning how to avoid combat. This was where easily the biggest contention came in to Silent Hill 2 being remade, when they announced and showed that they would be redoing and changing the camera, but the combat to coincide with that. Here, this was what the combat was in the original game, at least in a nutshell. Yeah, needless to say, it's pretty dull. What you see is what you get, essentially. You press the button, you do the animation, you hit something, you'll probably get a few times to dodge in between, you may get hit a little more than then, but it's pretty basic. It's a little more engaging than that, but there really is not too much intricacies to learn throughout the combat. However, in this remake, the combat has been much more redefined. It's still a little clunky, but definitely is way less annoying than it used to be. Sounds great, right? Well, the problem people had was with one little word: dodging. In the original game, for context, you did not in fact have a dodge. You had a block, which felt fitting enough, though it wasn't necessarily fun to use by any means. But when they learned that you'd be dodging and weaving, people were scared it was going to turn into Dark Souls. Now, to immediately calm those people down, it's nowhere near that. Heck, it's not even really close to something like Uncharted where you're rolling around dodging bullets or anything. You can in fact dodge in any direction, but you're locked into a pretty long animation and it has a lot of end lag, meaning that you can't really just spam it effectively. And enemies' attack patterns are now more recognizable, but are still challenging. And for those of you who think this may make it too easy, no. Because enemies actually have multiple different forms of attacks that they can do. The output of damage they do increases with the difficulty slider, should you wish to increase that. So overall, the combat was fine. I found it enjoyable enough, definitely more so than the original anyway, but I know that this will be a point of contention for many people, even after playing it. It's just going to be one of those things where I know people who played the original are probably going to prefer the original's combat over this. which I think that can pretty much summarize the whole thing. So here's my closing thoughts, for what they're worth, of Silent Hill 2's remake. Silent Hill 2 for PS5 is really, really good. If you've never been able to have the chance to play it, this is the perfect time to do so. It has a bunch of modern conveniences, but doesn't take away from what made the original so special, by keeping much of the core, and what made Silent Hill 2 such a phenomenal game. If you are a die-hard fan of the original, I still think almost all of you will find things to enjoy about this new one, as long as you don't go into it with the mindset of this being a replacement for the original, which, in my opinion, is a stupid mindset to begin with, since I think the original of any game remade can never truly be necessarily a replacement. There's always something that's going to be different for you to experience when you go look at the past, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a remake that keeps hold of so many key parts of its original. Okay, so yeah, the video's not quite over yet, but I promise it almost is. That was in fact my main overall thoughts of the game, so think of this as just a little bonus story time, since I think it would be disingenuous for me not to mention how the game runs. The game runs well, and you've always given the option of visual quality over gameplay, and what have you. I have no complaints when it comes to that. But I do want to bring up glitches, and I know immediately that's going to scare some people into thinking that this is a giant glitch fest of a game. It's not, in fact. Outside of a few weird visual glitches, like the pipe that the nurses hold clipping it to the ground or whatever, there was pretty much none, and those were the only two versions of which that really stood out to me. But there was one glitch that happened twice. The first time wasn't severe at all, and the second time was pretty bad, that I want to mention. That ties into the combat, as I mentioned earlier, so you know what I mentioned dodging as being able to dodge in all directions? Well, if you, like me, find yourself dodging backwards probably the most, which makes sense, you're getting the most space between you and the thing you're fighting over the game. The enemy, what the game does essentially is it gives the enemy a bit of a handicap, as if you were to spam the button too much during, let's say, attacks that you think you may be doing, like Alter Resolve, just any attacks. Well, if they're doing like an attack that hits multiple times, for example, in quick succession, you'll be greeted with a bunch of damage because they'll kind of just like gravitate halfway across the hallway to hit you, and you're going to get pushed back a little bit, which makes sense. You're getting hit by a giant blunt metal pipe, you're probably going to go flying back a little bit. However, James apparently has been eating very light ever since his wife's passing, because he goes flying, and by flying I mean that he can kind of clip out of bounds. Okay, we're not necessarily out of bounds in terms of like out of the walls or into the void or something like that. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that's possible, but you can get kind of stuck in the interiors where you weren't supposed to be, which I consider out of bounds. For example, in your room, you may see a lot of like junk on the sides and your walls and stuff, whether it be some low tables or some couches or whatnot. You know, basic furniture stuff that you can't go anywhere near, and it's sort of just an invisible like wall. However, on 2 occasions, I got pushed onto the furniture and then was stuck up there. So of course I had to finish the fight while being confined to a tiny area, but then after that I had to escape. The first time this happened wasn't too big of a deal. I was able to use the dodge button that got me in there in the first place, ironically enough. Was also able to get me out and back into play. A weird glitch, but I figured that probably wouldn't happen again. If it did, it'd be very easy to get back into bounds. That wasn't until later where it happened again. I was pushed into a corner and I got smacked in the head. And wouldn't you know it, I was stuck. And not only was I stuck, in fact, I could not get out. I tried dodging, nothing. I tried swinging my melee weapon, nothing. I was actually stuck, so sorry, Mary, I guess, but I think this is where it ends for James. I mean, this wasn't the biggest deal, as my last save point wasn't too far away, but still, the fact that this glitch is not good and is present, and at least up till the point of me recording, I think it's still in. But this could happen at all, again, is not good, but I am fairly confident something like this should be pretty easy for them to patch. And they're only the types of glitches that I noticed, again, were the tiny visual ones, which for me were very minor, and then the one gameplay ones, which definitely could cause problems, but didn't seem like it's going to be a common thing for you to run into. So, now, this is legitimately the end of the video. So with all that being said, if you liked this video, please like, comment, subscribe, dislike it if you disliked it, and I'll see you all in the next one.